This is actually 3 lessons in our book, but we're going to make it a 4th lesson because I'm going to have very special homework for you guys to do that's not in your book for that 4th week. But don't worry, I mean, you guys are really going to like it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty cool. So hopefully you guys will think it was cool too. We're just going to start in chapter 1 and we're going to go through chapter 4 and just give real brief overviews of the book of Ruth. And to get us into all of this convoluted craziness that I have up here on the board, we need to look in verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, what time in history does this take place?
Judges.
During the time of the Judges.
The last one, yeah.
Now, what this is about how long the time of the Judges actually lasted. It lasted between 338 and 385 years. And I get that from 1 Kings 6:1, and it put it at about 480 years. But if you subtract a year that it took them to reach Sinai, you have to subtract 10 to 25 years that it took them to conquer Canaan.
Oh, okay.
Then you have to subtract 4 years, because that was the reign of Solomon. Then you subtract 32 years for the reign of Saul. And then in there, because Samuel, remember, Samuel was the last judge, and he was also the first priest. So, and then we come into the time of history of the priests, but we don't know how far into Saul's reign he actually lived before he died. We don't know, before Samuel died. So that's how I come up with somewhere between 338 and 385 years. Is how long the judges were actually in control of the land of Israel. So like I said, unless you like math or just a real big history buff, that just doesn't even matter. But I thought it was kind of interesting. So in all of this, what was going on in Bethlehem at this point?
Famine.
Yeah, there was a big famine. And so we have a family who decided to move. Elimelech's family moved, and where did they move to?
Moab.
Moab, yes, to the
I
land of
couldn't think of the
Moab.
more. Hey.
It's like it's right there, I see it now. Did any of you look up what any of the names actually meant?
Naomi became bitter, but she was pleasant to begin with.
Yes, so her name was Pleasant, means pleasant. We able to look up Mahlon? Well, Elimelech first means my God is king, and that's actually on your paper. I didn't write the definitions, but Bethlehem means the house of bread.
House of bread, yeah.
House of what?
Of bread.
The house of
The
bread.
house of bread.
Yeah.
Their son Mahlon means sick. Helion means pining. I'm not sure what he was pining for, but he was pining for something. Orpah is a gazelle, so we're not quite sure what that says about how she looked. And Ruth means friendship. And what's interesting about these names is rarely is anyone named in Hebrew culture. I mean, now it's different, but in antiquity, they weren't really named when they were first born. People, the family tried to see, unless they were named after a relative or unless God told them what to name them beforehand, they kind of waited to see what their personality was, what they were going to be, and then they named them accordingly. So I'm not quite sure how you get your children to be named sick and pining, but that's what they named them.
They must have been.
Well, that's true. He must have been a sickly kid, and maybe they were pining. I really don't know. But that's what they named their children.
Since they died young, they must have continued to be ill.
Well, that's true. That's very true. And a lot of times, as we're given these names, we're given their circumstances surrounding, and this circumstance happened, and so when they had a baby, this is what they named them. But we're not told anything. I mean, we're not given any kind of history about them whatsoever, except they used to live in Bethlehem. There was a famine during the time of the Judges, and he moved, and Elimelech moved his family over to Moab. That's all we know. We don't know anything else about this family yet. At some point, Elimelech died, and his sons married foreign wives. And they were married to them for about 10 years, which is very interesting because in those 10 years they never had children. Because children are never mentioned. So in those 10 years they never had children, and then they died. If you looked up Moab in Genesis 19 and in Deuteronomy 23, what did we learn about Moab? What kind of place was it? Or what, excuse me, what had God said about it?
That lots of gods.
Yeah. Who was it named after? Who was Moab, the person? Do you remember who that was? That was Lot's son by an incestuous relationship with his oldest daughter. But it said that he did not know that she came in and he did not know when she left. And then the very next night, the younger sister went in. And so Moab is the son of Lot and his oldest daughter. And he went and he settled a place, and his descendants lived there, and so it was the land of Moab. In Deuteronomy, God said that no Moabite to the 10th generation would ever enter the assembly of God. So a Moabite would never be allowed to be part of Israel or even come alongside of Israel, to be a sojourner with Israel for 10 generations. So if we figure about 100 years a generation, is that about how it goes? That's 1,000 years. We haven't gotten to 1,000 years yet. We haven't even gotten a half of 1,000 years. Even if we stick with the full 480, we haven't gotten a half of that. But yet here's a man, an Israelite, who went and took his family into Moab to live.
The Israelites, when they were going to the promised land, they didn't want to go in there. They had to pass another route.
Right, and Moab was, the reason that God really kind of cursed them this way was because when the Israelites were coming through, Moab didn't help them. They never brought them food, they never brought them water, they did nothing. Not only that, but they hired somebody to go, and the son of Beor, to actually go and curse them. And God said, he didn't listen to that curse, and he blessed them instead. And so later on down in verse 6, it also says, God tells them, do not seek their peace or their prosperity. But yet here again is an Israelite who left the house of bread during a famine and who went into Moab.
Where are you?
I am in Deuteronomy 23,
Okay.
verses 1 through 6.
Okay.
That's okay. Keep me straight, Miss Susie, because I go everywhere.
I don't know what this is lost.
Deuteronomy 23?
23, 1 through 6.
Okay.
Is where it got to, and it was part, let me find the page for you. It was on, I believe it was, yes, on page 3 of your homework. Page 3, and then, well, page 4, number 5. So then, now we're going back to Ruth. Chapter 1, verses 6 through 14. Naomi heard something. What had she heard? Now her sons are dead. She's stuck with these two daughter-in-laws. The husband is dead. They have no way, really, back then, in culture, they had no way to really make a living for themselves. She was in a foreign land, but they lived there long enough. She could have picked up, language, their culture, their customs, something. But what had she heard about Israel, about Jerusalem?
Food and growth was happening.
Yeah, it was coming back. It said God visited there, and now everything was coming back up again. It was they had food. The house of bread was now producing wheat for bread. So what she decided to do?
Go.
Yeah, she decided to go back home. Problem was, she wasn't by herself. She felt really kind of obligated to these two daughter-in-laws that she got along the way. So what did she tell them?
Stay.
Go home.
Yeah.
Home.
Town home,
Why? Why would she tell them to go back home?
so they could find husbands.
Why did they need to go home to find husbands? Why couldn't they go to Israel to find husbands?
Because
Be with
she would-
family.
Oh, go
They
ahead.
wouldn't accept
Go
it.
ahead. No, you go ahead.
Why couldn't she just take them back to Israel, to Judah to find husbands? And
Like I said, they'd never be part of the Jewish people.
yeah, they would never be accepted there. Who was going to take them in? And how could she go back after all those years and not knowing what she was really going to run into as far as what would people think about her, about where she was, but she's going to bring Moabite daughter-in-laws with her? It wasn't going to make things very pleasant or very easy for her. And if you looked at, what did it say about Orpah? Where did Orpah decide to go? I believe...
She went back to Moab.
Yeah, but look in verse 15.
She-
It's very interesting. She went back to her people and
Her
Her
God.
her gods.
Yeah.
Remember, in this point in history, gods were very much connected to the land. So in Moab, you were expected to worship the god or gods of Moab. Now, that isn't to say that you couldn't worship other gods, but you had to make sure that you were actually worshiping their gods also. People took little household gods with them and they put them in their pocket and they traveled with them and they'd worship their god, their house god, their home god, and they'd also worship the god of the land that they were in. And Orpah went back and decided to worship her gods. So she went back. But what did Ruth do?
She went with Naomi.
Yeah.
She stayed with Naomi.
She went with her. Now, in verses 11 through 13, Naomi tells them explicitly, how are you going to be able to wait for me to have another son? If I happen to somehow find a husband today, at this moment, are you really going to wait all these years before that son has grown up enough that you're going to be able to marry him? And then I have to do it twice? So it's impossible for me to give you what legally in the Hebrew mindset you actually are owed. I can't do it. And what that's called is the Levirate law. And if a woman's husband, their first husband dies, and if they have no children, which they didn't, then the next brother in line, if there is a brother or close relative, marries that woman. The very first child that they have together, if it's a boy, technically belongs to the dead husband. Because women couldn't own property. Women couldn't pass things down to their children. So whatever inheritance, whatever land, whatever would have belonged, had that first husband and wife had a son, now belonged to that first baby. Any other children that they had after that, even if they had 100 more sons, belonged to the second husband. Only the first took the name of, and remember, would take the first name because they didn't have last names to go by. Took the name typically of the dead husband and therefore would continue the lineage in that name, in the land, with the inheritance that he would have gotten otherwise. So that's Levirate law. And we see it a real big story in Genesis 38 with Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. When, she went through the first son and he didn't treat her correctly and he died. God bless you. So then went through the second son and he didn't treat her correct, so he died. And Judah promised the third son, but kept him hidden away and wouldn't let her marry him. So she, through her, probably desperation, but she was actually pretty brilliant in her deception, ended up again having a child with her father-in-law. And does anybody remember, because this comes real important at the end of chapter 4, what that baby's name was? Perez.
Oh,
His name was
did
Perez.
twins, right?
No, his name was Perez. So keep that in mind, because that comes back around and we see him again.
Terrence.
I was going to say, was he Hispanic?
My lineage.
Oh, I wouldn't go through that lineage. That would not be one that I chose. The rest of this chapter is actually kind of neat. Because 16 through 17 were actually part of mine and Oscar's wedding vows. And it's also full of covenant. So do you want to read it, or do you want somebody else to read it, honey?
I'll read it.
Okay.
I read it 26 years ago. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me."
What's so beautiful about this, and such a contrast to Orpah, to the other daughter-in-law, is this is Ruth willing to give up everything, her complete identity. Because she said she's given up her people, which means her family, her people, her land, her country, her gods, and has wholly and wholeheartedly decided to become part of Naomi's, not only her life, but she wasn't going to hold anything from Moab and bring it with her. She was wholeheartedly exchanging those identities, and that's covenant. She was no longer going to be a Moabite. She was choosing to jump in with both feet and live as an Israelite, right down to worshiping their God.
She had a heart change.
She did. She had a huge heart change. And you have to wonder, during those times, either, when the sons were still there and they were living with Naomi, or that she just got to witness Naomi and the way she acted or the way she spoke, but God got to Ruth. Orpah, not so much. But he really got to Ruth. And he really got to her heart for her to make such an absolute change. So, they took off. When they got there, Naomi changed her name. No, not really, because everybody still called her Naomi. But what she changed her name to? Bitter. Mara. Bitter. Do you think that means that Naomi was bitter about the way her life was turning out?
Yeah.
Or was it the circumstances that she thought were bitter?
It says the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me, so I would say the circumstances.
And so she changed her name from a very pleasant name, literally, to something that was just bitter.
She lost 3 men in her life.
Yeah.
That's
And really, by losing 3 men, and not only that, but she has a Moabite daughter-in-law tagging along with her. How are they going to eat? How are they going to live? How are they going to take care of themselves? They're women in a very patriarchal society that, even though, and we know later on that Elimelech had land that they lived on, it didn't really even belong to her. And if you really think about it, it really didn't belong to anybody at that point, because no other relative had stepped in and taken it. So they could have stayed there, they could have stayed with friends, but that land wasn't even really hers. She couldn't do anything with it. She couldn't even sell it to get money. So this was not a very easy time for them. Even though there was all of this harvest going on and God had blessed the land and taken them out of this famine, it was still not going to be a very easy ride for Ruth and Naomi. And even more so for Naomi, because she had Ruth, and also really difficult for Ruth because she was going into a culture she didn't know, probably a language that she wasn't real fluent with, promised to worship a God she may or may not have ever really met. So this was not easy for any one of these ladies.
Now, did they travel alone, or how did that? I couldn't find it anywhere.
We don't know. We're not told. They could have gone along the King's Highway, which is actually still in existence today, which took them up along the top of the mountain ridges. So they could have taken that. It was a well-populated road. So they could have taken that. We don't know. They could have hooked on with other people and went on. I just don't know of very many people that would travel between Moab and Israel, knowing what God had said.
Yeah.
So we don't know. We have no idea.
Well,
So-
they were brave to do it.
They were brave or very desperate. Or poor Naomi probably thought, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose? I've lost everything else. So, what time of year did these events take place?
Barley season.
During the barley season. So, we get a really good description in the beginning of chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, of the latest to come on in, and his name was what?
Boaz.
Boaz. And Boaz's name actually means fleetness, like I guess fast.
Fleet.
Fleet, yeah, fleetness. And it's actually in Solomon's temple, the portico, the porch had 2 huge bronze pillars. And if you're looking at them, the one on the left was actually named after him. It's the Boaz pillar. A little more history. But yes, so it's actually named after him. Who can remember who Boaz's mother was?
Ooh.
No. No, I'm kidding. It wasn't
It was
who.
Rahab.
It was Rahab.
Yeah,
It
from-
was.
I knew
I
that,
was
but
shocked.
it just wouldn't come.
When I found it out.
Yeah, it was Rahab. And who was
Yeah.
Rahab? Was Rahab an Israelite?
No.
No.
No,
No.
she was a prostitute.
Jericho.
She
But she
was.
became one.
Yes, she did become one,
Yes.
but not until her entire city collapsed all around her. And she did actually help the Israelite spies when they went in to spy on the
Right.
city of Jericho. So you got to kind of think later on, Boaz already was sort of half foreign pagan, born. Because his mom wasn't an Israelite either. So he probably could have already had that heart once he realized who Ruth was. Because he already knew, you know what? It actually is possible for a pagan woman, or a pagan anybody, to actually come under the headship of God.
Well,
Because he saw his mother do it.
yeah. And then came Jesus from
Well, exactly.
that relationship.
So, so he, all of these things, that's so God, to think about that way back in history, God actually put, way back into this, God actually put these things in motion to make sure everything lined up for when this famine happened and Ruth came on the scene.
Wonderful. Fascinating.
I know.
Thrilling.
So, what do we know about Boaz?
He was rich and not married.
He was rich and single. What else do we need to know, right? He was rich and he was single. It never tells us what he looks like. A lot of places, like we know David was good looking. We know Jesus probably wasn't. He was a humble looking man.
He was old though.
Yes, and he was
Apparently.
older. But he had never been married. But he was older. He had a host of wealth of land. And he was a traveler. Because it says he came back home. So wherever he had been, he maybe went out on business or on a vacation. I mean, we don't know. But we know that he came back home. And it says that he was a relative. Now that I decided to call this lesson today, it's all relative.
Very appropriate.
Because if you looked up all of those relatives, even in the same verse, they don't all mean the same thing. This first relative, and I think I put on your sheet, is called a moda. And a moda is just a relative or an acquaintance. That's all they are.
A relative.
Just a relative or an acquaintance. It's a kinsman only in such that we're related to one another. Doesn't even have to be a close relative. Just, pick a relative. So kind of a generic term. And so it says that he was of the family of Elimelech, and he was a relative. He was a kinsman. And actually this word is only used right here and one time in Proverbs. And that's it. So, what did Ruth do so that she and Naomi could actually have some food?
Gleaned.
She would
He
go
gleaned.
behind.
Lean the wheat.
Where did she glean it?
Boaz's field.
Did she know who he was? No, because he wasn't even there. So it's not like Naomi could have seen him passing through town and said, hello, that's who that is. Because Ruth was already in the field when he came. So she didn't know whose field that was. Why or what in Scripture tells us that that was kind of commonplace?
Left food for them.
Yeah. Somebody want to run to Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 10.
Says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God.
Yeah, so you weren't supposed to go all the way out to the borders. Leave that alone. And don't go over it twice to go picking up what you might have dropped. And anything that falls, leave it there so that somebody else can use it. Somebody else can come by. The poor, the needy, the widows can come by and they can actually eat. And so, does it look like, from what we learn about Boaz, really even just from that verse, is Boaz a follower of the God of Israel?
So yes.
Yes.
I'd say yes. I'd say absolutely yes, because when he first saw Ruth, and when he speaks, he actually speaks about the Lord to his reapers, and then he blesses Ruth. And he blesses Ruth with the name of God, or in the name of God. So, why does Boaz tell, well, first, what does he tell his gleaners to do, or his reapers to do?
Leave extra.
Why?
I think because of Naomi.
Do you think he realized that that's who that was?
Oh, I don't know.
I think he thought Ruth was hot.
He probably thought she was good looking. That's why
was
she asked
cute.
about
That's
it.
what I didn't want to say.
But think about it also. Did she look like an Israelite woman? No.
Probably not.
Ethnically, she would have looked different.
Maybe she looked like his mother,
Well, she might have.
because she was different.
Yeah. But why does it say that he told them? It says, don't go from this one. Stay here, and stay. But he said, I have heard about your reputation. I have heard the kind of person you are. I heard what you're doing for your mother-in-law. I heard what you're doing. You're doing a good thing being out here. So you know what? Because of your reputation, because of what you're doing, you're not doing this for your own self. You're not doing this and keeping it all. You're actually doing it to benefit somebody else. In a place that you don't even understand, that you've never been before. So you know what? We're going to help her out a little bit more. We're going to say, you know what? Drop a little extra on purpose. And then he went to her personally and he said, you know what? Don't go anywhere else. Don't even look. Don't even put your eyes on anything else. Stay here. Because here, I'm not only going to make sure that you're fed, I'm going to make sure you're safe. Because I'm sure for single women out there, gleaning in the fields, in some fields it probably wasn't very safe. Especially for a foreign woman. I mean, who would really believe her if she said anything anyway? So he was not only looking out for her well-being, for her food, he was trying to keep her also safe. Which also tells me the heart of Boaz. He was a good guy. Because he still didn't know who she was. Not really, as that she is Naomi's daughter-in-law, that there's some kind of familiar connection between them.
Do you think probably the whole town was talking that she brought in this Moabite and
Probably.
gossip?
It's a small place.
Yeah,
We're not talking about, metropolitan New York. This is Judah. And what does the Bible say about Judah? It's the smallest among the clans. So it wasn't very big. Here's a woman they hadn't seen for, we don't know how long. We just know that, her sons died 10 years after, but we don't know how long it took them to actually decide to leave, to pack up to leave, to actually get there. Had to have taken time. So we don't know how long, probably maybe 15, 20 years since they'd seen her before. We don't know. Because we don't know how long they were there before Elimelech died, and we don't know how long they were there before her boys got married. So we don't know. So yeah, first of all, they were probably very excited. She probably had a lot of relatives that lived there. People did not tend to, move. And yeah, and they were probably wanting to tell her stories and to get stuff, and now here she's bitter, and she brought along this person who's not supposed to be here. But she's here. And if you notice, the person that they always address up to this point has always been Naomi. It's never been Ruth. So, verse 12 of chapter 2 gives us a really, really good insight about Ruth and Boaz. Because Boaz says to Ruth, "May the Lord," there he is, "reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Boaz was asking God to reward her work, and Ruth was getting rewarded because she had taken refuge under the God of Israel. Now, I forgot it at home, but I was going to bring my talit so you guys could see it. When they talk about wings, and they talk about it in other places in Jeremiah, they're not talking about like a bird. A lot of people will translate it to say under your feathers. It's got nothing to do with feathers. It's the talit. It's the corner of their prayer shawl on all four corners. There's something called a tzitzit. It's a woven anyway, and all the weaves mean something, and I won't get into it now, but it's a long piece, a long string. Now it's a long prayer shawl. I know Orthodox Jews do now. I don't know how they wore it back then, but they actually wear it, and it's got like a place for their head, and they wear it underneath, so you have the tassels, I guess, in the front and in the back. That is what they're talking about. That they would be covers. Those, and that's exactly what mine looks like. That, and we have several. And so that's what they're talking about. The wings are actually the corners of that, and that would be what he covered you with, so that you are completely covered. And they stand for the commandments, and so you would be completely wrapped within the law and protection. So if you ever see feathers, just laugh and say, Jesus didn't wear a feather boa, so it wasn't a feather. So in verses 14 through 23, what in the world is going on there? Boaz kind of ups the ante. And what I think is so funny is we are never told in any of this time that days and days and days have passed. I think this is still the same day. So Boaz does not waste time. He saw her, he heard about her, he liked her, and he's going to do everything he can to help her out. So what happens in verses 14 through 23? What's he do for her? How's he up that a bit?
They have lunch together.
Yeah.
It's true.
But where did she have lunch?
With the other workers.
Yeah, and who else was there? Boaz.
Oh.
Oh.
Boaz was there too. He wasn't going to leave her and maybe her think some other worker was kind of cute. So yeah, he was there. Do you think any of the other people that were allowed to come and glean his field got first dibs at the table?
No.
No, only her. And you have to imagine the rumors going around at this point, right? Because we thought the rumor mill was bad in some places, let me tell you. And then he said, you know what? It's not good enough. I don't want her bending over and having to pick up the stuff off the ground. Let her get what she wants out of the stuff you've already bundled, out of the sheaves. Let her glean there too. Just let her pick whatever she wants. And by the end of the day, she had an ephah worth of grain. That's about, I looked it up, about 93 cups. It's actually 92.999999 cups, which is equivalent to about 46.5 pounds of grain. And that was all the edible stuff, because it said she beat it, so she got all the stalks and all the chaff, you know, blew away. And after she was done, she had 46.5 pounds of grain to go take back to Naomi. And one of the kids in children's worship always said, man, women back then were beasts. Because after gleaning in this field all day long, she hauled over 46 pounds of grain back home. I couldn't carry 46 pounds of anything from here to probably that door. So yeah, so she carried it all back home again. And then, of course, Naomi's sitting at home probably hoping and praying that nothing really bad happened to her, and probably hoping she actually comes back and hasn't decided it wasn't worth the trouble. But she comes back and she asks a very important question. And what does she ask?
Where did you glean?
Yeah, where in the world did you get all this stuff? Where'd you get it? And Ruth tells her, from Boaz. And Naomi's light goes off, and she goes, aha. She had a very aha moment. Because who does it say Boaz was in verse 20?
He's a relative of her dead husband's.
A relative, and then he calls her the closest relative. So not only did she realize, wow, I just found a kinsman redeemer. But she also realized that, you know what? Boaz is pretty interested. We haven't been here a day,
She figured it out.
and God has already taken care of us. We didn't even have to wait. God took care of us on day one. So I don't think she kept the name bitterness for very long. Because by the end of day one, I would assume that 46.5 pounds was plenty of food for two women. At least for a couple days, I would think. But the next day came, and where did Ruth end up?
Same field.
Right back out in the field working again. She didn't wait till the food ran out. She went back, and she kept right on working. Now, we have some pretty interesting definitions to go on here. A close relative, which is the next it's all relative on your sheet, is called a karav. And karav, and that's what a B with a line under it makes a V sound. A karav is just something that's close. So it could be a close place, it could be something that's close in time, like something that's about to happen, or it's someone you have a personal relationship with. So now we're getting a little more serious. Now we're just not a moda. Now we're just not an acquaintance like he was in verse 1. He gets a promotion real quick to a karav, someone that has a personal relationship with Naomi and her family. Then she ups it one more time. This man got a few promotions in one day too. And says, he is one of our closest relatives. And that's even a totally different word in itself. And that is your Ga'al. And Ga'al is a really cool word. It means to redeem. But it not only means to redeem, I'm going to write it up here. It's also to act, I'll just put it, to act as a kinsman redeemer. It also means to avenge, to take revenge, to ransom, to redeem from slavery, to redeem the land, and to redeem by payment, which the definition of redemption is a payment. This is your Gaal. So in chapter 1, or verse 1 of chapter 2, he was an acquaintance. Just an acquaintance. An acquaintance. He was a moda. He was just an acquaintance, Boaz was. By the beginning of verse 20, he was a karav. He had a personal relationship, kind of a personal investment in the family. By the end of verse 20 of chapter 2, he's a Gaal. He's the closest relative and one with the capability to redeem. To redeem the land, to redeem from slavery, to redeem by payment, and to act as a kinsman redeemer. So how long was Ruth actually in Boaz's field? Day after day. 6 days a week. From the barley season to the what?
Wheat season.
To the wheat season. Barley season is like March, April, and then the wheat season ends like late May, early June. So she was there for probably somewhere between 6 and 7 weeks. She went out. So how is the relationship at this point that we know from the first 2 chapters? How was the relationship between Ruth and Naomi? How did they feel about one another? How did they act toward one another? Do you think, well, what do we have? We have Ruth completely changing the identity of who she had grown up with to be able to assimilate into Naomi's culture, to worship, the God of Naomi's land, the God of Israel, the language, probably the dress. It wasn't real easy work what she was doing every day, but she went out and did it. And she could have just gleaned enough of what she thought would be enough for herself and just walked away and just said, I'm done. I mean, this is hot, this is miserable. I could be back in Moab, I could be getting my own husband, I could be, having somebody else do all this for me. I don't have to do all this crazy work, and I'm doing it, for my mother-in-law. Now, we've all had mother-in-laws, and we are not going to dish on our mother-in-laws. This is not Dr. Phil. But we do get a lesson in interfamily relationships from Ruth and Naomi. And it's not that it was easy, and it's not really that Ruth had no obligation to her mother-in-law. None. Once her husband was dead. Any obligation that Ruth took on was one that Ruth took on for herself. So I'd say that they had to have a really close relationship. That they really loved each other. They really cared about each other. Because Naomi also didn't have to take her with them. She could have left Ruth where she was. She could have said, get off my land. You're making life difficult for me. But that's not what she did. So I'd say they had a really close relationship, a really good relationship. So then in Ruth 3, Mama gives good old daughter-in-law some instructions. And what does she tell Ruth to go and do?
Take a bath.
Take a bath. Because, girl, you need a bath. And after that, what'd she do?
Dress up.
Dress up, and then what did she do?
I don't know.
What'd she tell her to go do?
Notice where he lies down.
Yeah, go to the threshing floor, because that's where he's going to be.
Yeah.
Lots of things happen in the Old Testament in the threshing floor. Go to the threshing floor, that's where he's probably going to be overseeing some stuff. And for some reason, he's going to sleep there. I mean, he had to have had a house, but for some reason, he's going to sleep there. And while he's asleep, what's Ruth supposed to do?
Sleep by his feet.
You're gonna lay at his feet.
Why?
I have no idea.
Traditional.
Servant, like,
I
It is
I
kind of
wondered why it
humble.
wasn't a vulgar
Like-
thing to do. Why would a woman go to a field and lay at a man's feet? I mean,
Who was already sleeping. Someone look up, no, I'm sorry. When Ruth laid down at his feet. Well, let's just look. Starting in verse 8. It happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and he bent forward because she's laying down at his feet. And a woman was lying at his feet. Heck of a thing to wake up to. And he said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a Gaal. You are a close relative. You're my kinsman redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord. You have shown your last kindness to be better than your first, because you didn't go after a young man, whether he was rich or he was poor. Now, don't fear. I will do whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." What she was asking him to do is exactly what we read, what I prayed in Ezekiel 16, chapter 8. When God said, "I made a covenant with you, and I covered you with my skirt, and I made a covenant for you to be mine." What he was going to cover Ruth with was his talit.
oh,
When he covered her, that was his promise for protection. That was basically, that was a marriage proposal that both of them would have understood, or at least Boaz would have understood, as part of Levirate tradition, as part of the Levirate marriage tradition.
were there other women there? I mean,
Probably not, no.
I didn't think there
Not
would
at this
be.
point in time, no. They would all be at home. I mean, this was the middle of the night. The poor guy was sleeping and woke up with a woman laying on his feet. So, yeah, he took a second just to wake up and...
Usually you gotta be drunk.
Yeah, usually.
well, she waited till he was 8 and drank.
Yeah,
Yeah.
'cause she has to be drunk too, most of the time.
Oh, no, not again.
This happens every night. No, but
Oh, glory.
But I have a question. Do you think, when Naomi is explaining all this to Ruth, that Ruth really understood the custom? Do you think Ruth understood what she was going to be asking Boaz? Or what was actually going to take place? Or do you think Naomi tricked her into it?
I don't know that she actually understood the full implications of it, but I think she trusted her mother-in-law enough to do what she was told to do.
Right.
Because I'm telling you, if my mother-in-law told me to go find a man
Yeah, that's weird.
and lay down at his feet, I would really question what. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think she did know. I think she did know because that was the culture, not just, I mean, it was a man's world. And women were nothing. They were servant slaves. So I think she did know.
Do you think even though she was a Moabite, she'd only been there for about 7 weeks, that she would have understood Levirate, which was a very Jewish cultural thing? It was not a Moabite culture or cultural aspect. Do you think she would have understood that she was actually going in there to go get married?
If somebody told me to go sleep by somebody's feet, I'm doing something.
Yeah, it's just not, yeah.
I mean,
He's already fed you, he's already given you, yeah. And we don't know, Naomi could have explained to her what was going on. She already told her he was one of the closest relatives, he was a kinsman redeemer. But at this point, you know, Ruth was also very vulnerable. Nobody else was around. And I think the fact that Boaz the way he treated her, even when nobody else was around, showed also what kind of man he really was. Because it would have been very easy for him to do anything. She was still a foreign woman. Again, who would have ever believed her? They'd have just run her out of town, which is where most of them probably wanted to do to begin with. But instead, he blesses her. Again, he blesses her. But then he realizes there's a problem. And what was the problem?
There was one closer.
Closer relative.
One
Yeah.
all closer.
Ah! That darn law. There's actually somebody who's a closer relative than I am. And unfortunately, regardless of how our hearts pitter-patter for one another, he actually gets first dibs. He has that right. So then we look at chapter 4, and what happens in chapter 4.
Boaz gonna take care of the situation.
He is. And he does it exactly according to the law and how they're supposed to do it. He doesn't take matters into his own hands. He doesn't try to, strip this away from the other guy. He doesn't try to go behind anybody's back. He goes straight to the guy. And we don't know how he and Boaz were even related. They could have been brothers, they could have been cousins, they could have been, we have no clue. But we know the man that he went to probably had other family at this point.
Yeah.
So he could have been older. Well, he had to have been older if he came first. So he was even older than Boaz. Can you imagine sitting at home, Ruth and Naomi, waiting for Boaz to show up to figure out what had just happened? Who is Ruth going to marry today?
I think Naomi knew. She said, this man will
Do what needs to be done. Because she said, he'll get it done today. So he went to that closest relative. And where was he when he spoke to him?
city gate.
Yeah. Have you ever noticed that everything happens outside the city gate? Very rarely do we see things, especially legal judgments, ever happening inside the city gates.
Must have nice benches and stuff.
People go outside the city gates. And in the time of the judges, that's exactly what they did. The judges would take turns and they'd sit outside the city gate, and people would go to them and with their problems or with their issues or whatever. And so it would make sense that this is a very legal matter that's about to happen. A religiously legal matter, but also a legal matter because there's going to be some transactions going on. So he went outside the gate because that's where all the men kind of hung out anyway. And he gathered 10 men. Why would he need 10 men?
Quorum.
A quorum. It's called a minyan. And they had to be elders. They had to be religious elders of the law. And it took 10 to witness any kind of legal transaction. So with those 10 men, there was no way this other relative could go back and say that anything funny or anything bad or anything whatever, that he was tricked in any way, shape, or form. They witnessed the transaction. So he gathered up everybody together, and he was smart. He didn't lead with, there's this really hot young chick. What did he lead with?
Hey, you're the closest by the land.
The land. And that word for buy is ga'al. It's to redeem the land. So he said, yeah, there's all this land, Naomi's back, the land's got to go, and it's really cool, and it belongs to the relative, and I'd like to have it, but I know who you are, you're ahead of me in the game, so do you want the land? And the guy says, well, you know what? Yeah, I would like the land. I really do. And then Boaz says, well, you see, that's not all. Because attached to the land comes a woman who doesn't have any children and needs a kinsman redeemer. And this is who she is. And I don't think that man could have backed out any faster if he tried. But why does he say he won't marry Ruth?
So he doesn't want to ruin his inheritance, or
Yeah. How could he have ruined his inheritance? Who would he have been marrying?
the
A
son.
Moabite woman. Any child that he had with her would have inherited the land that technically the guy just bought. That land that he bought and paid for would then belong to a child of a Moabite woman. That they were explicitly told, you don't find peace with them, you don't find prosperity with them, and to the 10th generation, they ain't allowed here. I think that's what he was more worried about than his own land and his children and who would get this and who would get that. And if they had more than one child, he'd have to divvy up the land between those also. And I think it was more like, yeah, you know, because in verse 10, Boaz makes it very, very clear, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess. If he'd have said, I acquired Ruth, the Israelite widow of Mahlon, I don't think we'd be seeing Boaz's name here. But he made it very clear who she was.
So it was because she was a Moabite, and not because the land would have belonged to the son, which technically.
A Moabite would now have a Moabite, because remember through the
But
mother's
Timon
line.
was still was an Israelite.
Start over again.
The son, Naomi's son, was still a.
Naomi's son was. But this guy still would have been having a baby with a Moabite woman. And if they had any other children, they would have been half Moabite. But when you think about that the lineage comes from the lineage of the maternal, they would have been Moabite children that would now have had inheritance in the land of Israel, which was a no-no according to the scripture we read. To 10 generations, and at best, we're 338 to 380 some odd years into that 1,000 years. So I think it was a lot of stuff playing all at once. But either way, this guy was like, yeah, you know what? No. Take them, take the land, take the woman.
Question.
Oh, sure, go right ahead, right ahead.
Maybe the lineage would have been Malayon, or whatever his name is, and because women really didn't have the land, they didn't inherit the land.
Right. But if they had any other children, those would have been Moabite children. Because the parentage, the lineage, not, maybe I'm saying it wrong. If a Jewish woman had a baby with a Moabite man, the children would be seen as Jewish. If a Jewish man had a woman by a Moabite woman, the child would have been seen as a Moabite. So the cultural heritage, I guess, or the culture or the nationality, there we go, the word came. Nationality went on the maternal side. So maternally speaking, any children that this other closest relative had, this all had with Ruth, would have been considered Moabite children. And even if he was having it and it was considered a descendant of Mahlon, they still would have been Moabite children because Ruth was still a Moabite. So I think it just caused...
Women just didn't count.
They didn't, but as far as nationality, they did. And it's actually still like that now.
What's confusing is this: I would jeopardize my own inheritance. So, how is that jeopardizing his own inheritance?
Where are you, please?
On 6.
If Ruth would have had a first son,
He would have been the head, so he would have inherited not only the
No, he
previous
would
one,
only
but
have
also-
inherited. Nope, he would only inherited Mahlon because that would have been considered Mahlon's child. He would have inherited Mahlon's property only. Any children they had after that, then this other relative those children would legally belong to the second husband, and would then have rights of inheritance for the second husband.
Oh, so the first son would
Would
be
have
Mahlon's
gotten
inheritance,
only
not
Mahlon's
all.
inheritance, which would have been the land that the poor guy had to buy to begin with. Because that was Mahlon, that was Elimelech's property.
So I guess as long as he was able to buy the land with no strings attached, he was okay with it.
Yeah, he was okay with the land. He was perfectly happy with the land. He just didn't want the lady attached to it. He didn't want anything to do with her. That just opened a whole big old can of
Do
worms.
you suppose
He wasn't
since he
interested
had to
in.
be even older that he may have already been married?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure he was probably already married. He probably
So
already
he
had
was
children.
jeopardizing his inheritance by the fact that his wife might kill him.
Well, yeah, his first wife. Yeah, and that could be too. And then he would have nothing.
See, that's still weird though, that I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Well, how is that jeopardizing his own inheritance? The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself. I cannot redeem it because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You have a right of redemption. I don't know. I'll have to.
Look it up. But either way, he didn't want the lady.
Yeah.
He didn't want her. Which, Boaz probably went, phew, good enough for me. And so what did he do that was kind of weird?
The
Change
shoe,
sandals.
sandal.
Yeah, now in actual Levirate law, if a man who was the closest relative, if Ruth had gone to this relative, well, no, if a Jewish woman would have gone to this relative and said, you are my kinsman redeemer, you are my Gaal. And if he refused and said, you know what, ain't no way, I'm not marrying you, I'm not taking you on, I'm not doing anything. She actually is told to take off her own shoe, smack him with it, and spit in his face.
Ah,
And then from then on, that man is known as, is it the man who didn't sit the gate or the man who did sit the gate? Or anyway, it was some kind of title this man was now given to basically show he didn't live up to what he was supposed to do. He didn't live up to,
Be a kinsman redeemer.
yeah, he didn't do what he was supposed to do. But I guess Boaz was really happy, so they skipped the whole smacking upside the head, and they just exchanged a sandal. And that's weird to us, but that's just what they did. And so then he went home, and he married Ruth. Yay! And in verses 11 through 14, look at the blessings that they were given. And now Ruth finally gets some blessings. In verse 11, what do those elders say?
may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephratah. I don't know.
No, that's fine.
Become famous in Bethlehem.
So, to be like Rachel and Leah, who both built up the house of Israel, because we know between them and their maids, they had 12 boys who actually became the tribes of Israel. How did Ruth and Boaz build the house of Israel? Who was in their lineage?
Continuing the lineage for David
David.
and Jesus.
Yeah, all the way to Jesus. Jesus, and building up the house. Who else's house, if you look back down, in verse 12, who else's house do they bless Ruth and Boaz to be like?
Perez.
Perez.
Oh, I
You
remember
said-
you
You mentioned that from the beginning.
In the beginning, yeah.
Tamar, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. Now, why in the world would they want her house to be like Perez? That was kind of odd.
I don't know, because it was not a good relationship.
No, he
A
wasn't born out of the
daughter-in-law.
best situations. He was born from an incestuous relationship because Judah actually refused Tamar's right to levirate marriage. And so she tricked him, and Perez was born. Moab, the land that Ruth is from, was actually named after a man, Moab, who was also from an incestuous relationship between a father and a daughter, the oldest daughter of Lot, unbeknownst to him. And so maybe it was just a, kind of maybe a coming together between Judah and Moab.
Could be.
I mean, I don't know, but these two guys, these two people, Moab and Perez do have some things, similarities. And I can't think why else anybody would want to say, to tell them, may your house be like the house of Perez. And whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring, which the Lord will give you in this woman. Although we know that Jesus is called the Lion of Judah. Of course, they didn't know this back then. So, I mean, it could be a foretelling of what was going to happen. So, I mean, I really don't know. And so they got together and they had a baby. And who else got blessed? Who else did the women bless? Naomi. And what did they bless her with in 14 and 15? It says, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a Redeemer today. And may his name become famous in Israel. Who was Naomi's Redeemer? Nope. If you look in 15, it says, may he, whoever that he is, also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. So who is the Redeemer? Is Naomi's Redeemer?
The son of Ruth and Boaz.
Whose name was? Obed. And Obed means serving.
And Obed,
Jesse, David.
And David. And down through some more generations into Jesus. And it's just so God, again, that these women are blessing for the here and now, for Naomi, here and now, because it said Naomi actually gave the baby his name. Naomi actually named him Obed.
Oh.
For the right now, but how that blessing is really a prophetic blessing for what was going to happen in the future, because that word restore is shuv. It's the same one as turn around. And it means to turn back, to return, or to refresh. So she said, this Redeemer that you have, this little baby, is going to return you. Return you not from that bitterness back to your joy, back to your pleasantness. He's going to be a sustainer, a cool, which means to support, or to endure, or to maintain. So that's what the blessing they were giving her in the name, really, of her grandson. But what a prophetic blessing for what we actually get from our Redeemer, who is our sustainer and our restorer. So they were speaking for the now, but I think it was a very prophetic blessing. And did his name actually become famous in the land of Israel? And his name is not just his name Obed, but his name as in his name through the lineage of his name. Yeah, of course it did. Because of Jesus. So, 4 chapters, we see it as a love story, but there's so much more in this than just on the surface. Next week, we're actually going to take a closer look at this whole concept of Gaal and this whole concept of kinsman redeemer. And I lied, it is not next week. We are going on a very well-deserved vacation, and so we will not be here next week. So the 13th, June 13th, we will be back to do our second lesson in the book of Ruth.
I won't be here, but I do have something to say.
Sure, absolutely, please.
Perez was a twin.
Was he a twin?
Yes, I thought so, because I had just gone through
He
Genesis.
was a one?
He was a twin. So,
Okay.
Judah, Tamar dressed up like a prostitute, and
Right.
Judah took her. And then 3 months later, she came to Judah, and then it came about the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth. One put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on
The
his
red,
hand,
yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
"This one came out first."
But then he-
But it came about as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out. Then she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah.
So he was. And now that you say that, of course I remember. Because he was the breacher. He was the one, or the one who breaks out. So yes, so,
Perez and Zerah.
yes. So he was the breacher. And we see that a lot. And we're actually going to see that next week, or 2 weeks from now. So anything else? Thank you so much.